They called her paranoid for organizing files that others threw away, obsessive for reading reports that weren't meant for her eyes, and suspicious for asking questions that made superior officers uncomfortable. But when Margaret Chen uncovered the enemy infiltration that had been bleeding classified intelligence for 18 months, those same officers realized that sometimes the most dangerous threats hide in plain sight, visible only to those everyone dismisses as insignificant. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The fluorescent lights in building C cast their familiar harsh glow across rows of beige filing cabinets and government-issued metal desks. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical persistence, fighting against the humid Virginia summer that pressed against the windows of the Defense Intelligence Compound. Margaret Chen sat at her workstation in the administrative pool, a space carefully positioned between the classified briefing rooms and the main corridor where officers passed without noticing the civilians who kept their world organized. Her desk occupied the middle ground of bureaucratic invisibility, close enough to overhear fragments of important conversations, far enough from decision-making centers to be considered harmless background. The nameplate reading M. Chen, administrative specialist, sat beside a coffee mug that had grown cold hours ago, forgotten amid the steady rhythm of typing, filing, and processing that defined her official duties. Margaret's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, entering data from intelligence reports into the central database system. Each entry required attention to detail that most people found tedious, but she approached the work with methodical precision that had earned her consistent performance ratings without attracting particular notice. Her supervisor appreciated reliability. Her colleagues respected competence without feeling threatened by ambition. The morning briefing materials lay, stacked in perfect alignment beside her monitor. Incident reports from overseas operations, personnel transfer orders, equipment requisition forms, and communication logs that chronicled the daily operations of military intelligence work. Most administrative staff process these documents without reading their contents, treating them as data entry exercises rather than windows into complex global operations. Margaret read everything. Her background had taught her that information patterns often revealed more than individual pieces of data, and habits formed during 22 years of Army service didn't disappear simply because she now wore civilian clothes to work. She had retired as a master sergeant after serving in military intelligence units across 3 continents, but the transition to civilian employment had required accepting positions that barely utilized her analytical training. The irony wasn't lost on her. She possessed more field experience than half the junior officers who walked past her desk daily, but her current role limited her to organizing their paperwork and maintaining their filing systems. The demotion from analyst to administrator had been necessary for financial reasons. Civilian intelligence positions required security clearances that took months to process, and she needed employment immediately after retirement. Her military bearing remained evident, despite the business casual attire required for civilian employees. She sat with perfect posture, maintained clear sightlines to all room entrances, and organized her workspace with geometric precision that reflected decades of inspection-ready standards. Colleagues occasionally commented on her attention to detail, usually with mild amusement rather than admiration. The personnel directory listed her education as some college, a classification that failed to mention the advanced intelligence analysis courses, counterintelligence training, and language certifications that had defined her military career. Her official job description emphasized filing, typing, and general administrative support without referencing the pattern recognition skills that had once identified enemy infiltration networks in combat zones. Around 10:30, Major Harrison emerged from Conference Room B, carrying a stack of classified folders that needed processing before the afternoon briefing. He approached Margaret's desk with the distracted efficiency of someone accustomed to having administrative details handled without personal involvement. "Chen, I need these logged and filed by 1400, he said, placing the folders beside her keyboard without making eye contact. "Standard security protocols, nothing complicated." Margaret accepted the assignment with a professional nod, waiting until Harrison had returned to his office before examining the materials. The folders contained after-action reports from recent operations in Eastern Europe, personnel assessments from field commanders, and communication intercepts that had been translated from multiple languages. The classification markings indicated sensitive intelligence that required careful handling. As she processed the first folder, Margaret noticed an inconsistency in the communication logs. A series of encrypted messages had been received through channels that didn't match the originating units listed in the official records. The discrepancy was subtle, the kind of administrative error that most people would attribute to clerical mistakes or system glitches. But Margaret's experience had taught her that small inconsistencies often indicated larger problems. During her deployment in Afghanistan, she had identified an enemy informant by noticing that patrol reports consistently contained minor errors in location coordinates. The mistakes had seemed random until she mapped them chronologically and discovered they formed a pattern that revealed classified movement schedules to hostile forces. She opened a new spreadsheet and began tracking the communication discrepancies across multiple reports. The pattern that emerged suggested something more serious than clerical errors. Messages were being routed through intermediate stations that weren't part of standard communication protocols. The timing of these irregular transmissions coincided with specific operational briefings in ways that seemed too consistent to be coincidental. Margaret printed a copy of her analysis and placed it in her personal files, separate from the official documentation that would be returned to Major Harrison's office. She had learned to maintain detailed records of unusual observations, even when they seemed unimportant at the time. Pattern recognition required patience and the willingness to preserve information that others might discard as irrelevant. The lunch hour arrived with its typical exodus of personnel toward the cafeteria and outdoor smoking areas. Margaret remained at her desk, using the quiet period to continue her analysis of the communication logs. The building's population dropped by half during lunch breaks, creating an atmosphere of reduced activity that she found conducive to concentrated work. She accessed additional files through her administrative credentials, cross-referencing the irregular communications with personnel assignments and operational schedules. The pattern became more pronounced as she expanded her data set. Someone with access to classified briefing materials was sharing information through unauthorized channels, using communication methods that bypassed normal security protocols. The implications were serious enough to warrant reporting through proper channels, but Margaret understood the challenges that would accompany such a report. Her administrative position carried limited credibility when challenging the security protocols that governed classified operations. Military hierarchy placed significant weight on rank and position when evaluating intelligence assessments, and civilian administrative staff occupied the lowest levels of that hierarchy. She continued her analysis throughout the afternoon, documenting every discrepancy and building a comprehensive case that supported her suspicions. The work required careful attention to detail and systematic organization of complex information, skills that her military training had developed, but her current position rarely utilized. At 4:30, Major Harrison returned to collect the processed folders. He glanced at Margaret's desk, noting the neat stacks of completed paperwork and the spreadsheets that covered her monitor screen. "Everything filed correctly?" he asked, his tone suggesting routine inquiry rather than genuine interest. "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the completed files. "All materials processed according to standard protocols." Harrison nodded and gathered the folders without further comment. He paused momentarily when he noticed the spreadsheets on her screen, but didn't ask about their contents. Administrative. Staff often created organizational tools that helped them manage their workload more efficiently, and such initiatives were generally encouraged as long as they didn't interfere with official duties. After Harrison left, Margaret saved her analysis files and secured them in her locked desk drawer. She had identified what appeared to be a significant security breach, but her position in the organizational hierarchy made it difficult to report her findings through appropriate channels. Her observations would need to be presented carefully, with sufficient documentation to overcome the natural skepticism that would greet intelligence assessments from administrative personnel. The day ended with the familiar routine of securing classified materials and preparing workstations for the overnight cleaning crews. Margaret gathered her personal belongings and walked toward the parking lot, passing groups of officers who discussed weekend plans and social activities. Their conversations reflected the comfortable assumption that security threats were managed by people with appropriate authority and expertise. Margaret understood that assumption, but she also knew that the most dangerous security breaches often occurred in plain sight, hidden among routine administrative processes that seemed too mundane to warrant careful scrutiny. Her analysis suggested that someone was exploiting exactly that kind of institutional blind spot, using the administrative infrastructure to facilitate unauthorized information sharing. As she drove home through the suburban Virginia traffic, Margaret considered her options for reporting the security concerns she had identified. The challenge would be convincing her superiors that an administrative specialist had uncovered something that the professional intelligence analysts had missed. Her military experience provided credibility, but her current civilian status limited her access to the decision-makers who could authorize proper investigation. The pattern she had discovered was real, documented, and potentially dangerous to ongoing operations. Whether anyone would listen to her warnings remained to be seen, but Margaret had learned long ago that doing the right thing often required persistence in the face of institutional resistance. The quiet competence that had defined her military career would be tested in ways she hadn't anticipated when she accepted what everyone considered a simple administrative position. The morning coffee ritual in the administrative pool followed the same predictable patterns that had established themselves over months of routine interaction. Sandra Williams, the senior administrative coordinator, held court near the break room entrance with her usual commentary about weekend activities and celebrity gossip gleaned from social media. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had occupied the same position for 15 years and considered herself the unofficial spokesperson for civilian staff concerns. Margaret arrived at 7:30, 30 minutes before the official start time, carrying her thermal coffee mug, the leather portfolio that contained her personal notes from the previous day's analysis. She moved through the morning setup routine with military precision, powering up her computer systems and organizing her workspace while the building gradually filled with the sounds of arriving personnel. Sandra's attention focused on Margaret as she settled into her workstation. "Chun, you're here early again," she observed with mild disapproval. "You know they're not paying overtime for voluntary extra hours, right? This isn't the army anymore. Nobody expects you to be first in and last out every day." Margaret nodded politely without engaging in extended conversation. She had learned that Sandra interpreted professional dedication as either show-off behavior or naive misunderstanding of civilian work culture. The suggestion that maintaining high standards somehow violated unspoken agreements about appropriate effort levels reflected attitudes that Margaret found difficult to navigate. "I just prefer getting organized before the day starts," Margaret replied, opening the classified folder that had been left on her desk overnight. "Helps me stay on top of the workload." Sandra exchanged glances with Jennifer Martinez, another administrative specialist whose desk occupied the adjacent pod. The look conveyed shared understanding about Margaret's peculiarities, A silent communication that excluded her from the informal network that shaped workplace social dynamics. Organization is one thing, Jennifer added, stirring artificial sweetener into her coffee with deliberate slowness. But you spend way too much time reading through everything. Most of this stuff is just routine paperwork. Process it, file it, move on. You don't need to memorize every detail. The criticism contained an implicit challenge to Margaret's work methods, suggesting that her attention to detail represented inefficiency rather than thoroughness. The administrative pool operated on productivity metrics that rewarded speed over accuracy, processing volume over analytical depth. Margaret's approach conflicted with prevailing attitudes about how classified materials should be handled by support personnel. Sometimes I notice patterns that seem worth tracking, Margaret said, careful to keep her tone neutral and professional. Background information can provide context that helps with processing decisions. Sandra laughed with the casual dismissiveness that had become her standard response to Margaret's comments about analytical work. Patterns? Chun, you're filing incident reports, not conducting intelligence analysis. Leave the pattern recognition to the people with security clearances and graduate degrees. Your job is to make sure the paperwork gets where it's supposed to go. The distinction between administrative processing and analytical work had been emphasized repeatedly since Margaret's arrival at the facility. Civilian support staff were expected to handle classified materials without engaging with their content beyond what was necessary for proper filing and distribution. The boundary between support and analysis was carefully maintained through both formal policies and informal social pressure. Margaret returned her attention to the morning's assignment, a collection of personnel transfer orders and operational updates that required database entry and filing. The work provided cover for her continued analysis of the communication irregularities she had identified the previous day. Each document she processed was cross-referenced against her private spreadsheet, expanding the dataset that supported her growing concerns about unauthorized information sharing. Around 9:15, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens emerged from the secure briefing area with his customary expression of focused intensity. Stevens commanded respect throughout the facility as someone whose operational experience and analytical expertise had shaped intelligence policy at the highest levels. His presence in the administrative area usually indicated priority assignments that required immediate attention. Chun, Stevens called, approaching her desk with a folder marked with multiple classification stamps. I need complete processing on these intercept logs. Full database integration, cross-referenced filing, and distribution to the briefing team by 1100 hours. Margaret accepted the assignment and opened the folder to assess the scope of work involved. The intercept logs contained communication data from recent operations in the Baltic region, including encrypted messages that had been decoded by specialized linguistic teams. The material was highly classified and operationally sensitive, requiring careful handling throughout the processing workflow. Stevens lingered near her desk as she reviewed the documents, his expression suggesting that he wanted to provide additional guidance about the assignment. These intercepts are part of an ongoing counterintelligence investigation, he explained, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation remained private. Any irregularities or unusual patterns should be flagged immediately. We're particularly interested in communication timing and routing anomalies. The instruction aligned perfectly with Margaret's existing concerns about unauthorized information sharing, but she was careful not to reveal her previous analysis work. Her administrative position didn't authorize independent intelligence assessments, and Stevens' request represented the first official recognition that pattern analysis might be relevant to her duties. Understood, sir, Margaret replied. I'll flag any anomalies I encounter during processing. After Stevens returned to his office, Margaret began detailed examination of the intercept logs. The communication data revealed the same irregular routing patterns she had identified in previous materials, but with additional details that strengthened her analysis. Messages were being transmitted through intermediate stations that weren't part of standard military communication networks, using encryption methods that differed from approved protocols. More significantly, the timing of these irregular communications correlated with specific briefing schedules in ways that suggested inside knowledge of classified planning activities. Someone with access to operational briefings was sharing information through unauthorized channels, using communication methods designed to avoid detection by normal security monitoring systems. Sandra approached Margaret's desk around 10:30, ostensibly to discuss lunch plans, but actually to satisfy her curiosity about the classified materials that had commanded Lieutenant Colonel Stevens' personal attention. Her interest in Margaret's assignments had increased proportionally with their apparent importance, reflecting office dynamics that valued proximity to significant work over actual contribution to results. "What's the big project Stevens dumped on you?" Sandra asked, attempting to peer at the documents spread across Margaret's workspace. "Must be something major if he's personally delivering assignments to administrative staff." Margaret closed the folder diplomatically, following security protocols that prohibited unauthorized personnel from viewing classified contents. "Just routine processing work," she replied. "Nothing particularly unusual." Sandra's expression shifted to mild irritation at being excluded from information she considered herself entitled to know. Her position as senior administrative coordinator had created expectations of access to details about all projects affecting the civilian staff, and Margaret's discretion challenged those assumptions. "You know, Chen, there's such a thing as being too secretive," Sandra said, her tone carrying an edge of criticism. "We're all on the same team here. A little transparency about workload distribution would help with resource planning." The comment reflected broader tensions about Margaret's integration into the administrative team. Her military background and professional discretion set her apart from colleagues who shared information freely and considered workplace gossip a legitimate form of social bonding. The cultural differences created friction that affected daily interactions and collaborative relationships. Margaret continued her analysis throughout the morning, documenting additional evidence of unauthorized communication activities. The pattern had become unmistakable, supported by multiple data points that eliminated the possibility of coincidental errors or system malfunctions. Someone was systematically compromising operational security through carefully orchestrated information sharing that exploited administrative processing procedures. Jennifer Martinez joined Sandra near Margaret's desk during the mid-morning break, their conversation loud enough to ensure Margaret could overhear their commentary about her work habits and social integration challenges. "She acts like she's still in the military," Jennifer observed, glancing toward Margaret with obvious disapproval. "Always so formal, so serious about everything. This is civilian government work, not combat operations. We're supposed to be collaborative and team-oriented." Sandra nodded emphatically, seizing the opportunity to reinforce her critique of Margaret's professional approach. "Exactly. She treats routine paperwork like it's some kind of intelligence mission. Reading every word, taking notes, asking questions about things that don't concern administrative staff. It's like she doesn't understand her role here." The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth that Margaret couldn't directly address. She was treating the administrative work as an intelligence mission because her experience had taught her that security threats often emerged from careful analysis of routine information. But explaining that perspective would require revealing the extent of her analytical activities, potentially violating the boundaries that separated administrative support from intelligence analysis. Margaret completed the intercept log processing ahead of schedule, producing comprehensive database entries and organizational summaries that exceeded the standard requirements for such assignments. Her analysis had identified 17 separate instances of irregular communication routing, all connected to operational briefings that had occurred within the previous 6 weeks. The evidence supported a clear conclusion. Someone with authorized access to classified briefings was sharing operational intelligence through unauthorized communication channels. The security breach was systematic, ongoing, and sophisticated enough to avoid detection by automated monitoring systems that focused on obvious violations rather than subtle pattern anomalies. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens returned to collect the processed materials at exactly 1100 hours, reviewing Margaret's work with the careful attention that classified assignments demanded. His expression remained neutral as he examined her documentation, but she noticed that he spent considerable time reviewing the summary sheets that highlighted communication irregularities. "Thorough work, Chen," Stevens commented, gathering the folders with professional efficiency. "Your attention to detail is appreciated." The acknowledgement represented the first direct praise Margaret had received for her analytical approach to administrative duties. Stevens' recognition validated her methods and suggested that her pattern analysis might be valued by personnel with appropriate authority to act on intelligence assessments. After Stevens left, Margaret returned to her regular duties with growing certainty that she had identified a serious security breach. The challenge would be communicating her findings through appropriate channels without overstepping the boundaries that defined her administrative role. Her military experience provided analytical skills that civilian colleagues lacked, but her current position limited her credibility when presenting intelligence assessments to decision-making authorities. The morning had established a pattern that would define the coming days: professional competence that generated results, social isolation that reflected cultural differences, and growing evidence of security threats that required careful documentation and strategic presentation. Margaret understood that her next steps would determine whether her discoveries would be taken seriously or dismissed as administrative overreach by someone who didn't understand her proper role in the intelligence community. The afternoon brought a steady stream of routine assignments that provided perfect cover for Margaret's expanding investigation. Her desk had become a convergence point for classified materials from multiple departments, each document offering additional pieces of the puzzle she had been assembling over the past several days. The communication irregularities she had initially dismissed as clerical errors were revealing themselves as components of a sophisticated intelligence operation. While processing personnel transfer orders for the Baltic operations team, Margaret discovered that 3 key intelligence analysts had been temporarily reassigned during the exact time frame when the unauthorized communications had intensified. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had deliberately arranged for specific personnel to be absent during critical operational planning phases, creating information gaps that facilitated unauthorized access to classified briefings. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, entering data while simultaneously cross-referencing names, dates, and security clearance levels against her private analytical files. The work required extraordinary concentration to maintain both her official processing duties and her covert investigation without attracting attention from colleagues who had already expressed skepticism about her attention to detail. The intercept logs from Lieutenant Colonel Stevens contained additional evidence that strengthened her case. Encrypted messages were being transmitted using frequency modulations that didn't match standard military communication protocols. More troubling, the encryption signatures suggested that the unauthorized transmissions were originating from within the facility itself, using equipment that had been modified to bypass normal security monitoring systems. Margaret opened a secure note-taking application on her personal smartphone, carefully documenting the technical specifications that supported her analysis. Military intelligence training had taught her to preserve evidence in multiple formats, ensuring that critical information couldn't be lost through system failures or administrative interference. Her notes included precise timestamps, communication frequencies, and encryption patterns that would be necessary for forensic investigation. Around 2 o'clock, Dr. Patricia Hawkins from the linguistics department approached Margaret's desk with a translation request that required immediate priority processing. Dr. Hawkins carried herself with the academic authority of someone whose expertise was regularly consulted by senior military commanders, but her interaction style suggested genuine respect for administrative personnel rather than the condescending attitude that characterized many officer relationships with civilian staff. "Margaret, I have some intercepted communications that need database integration before tomorrow's briefing," Dr. Hawkins explained, placing the classified folder beside Margaret's keyboard. "The material is particularly sensitive, so I wanted to handle the processing personally rather than routing it through normal administrative channels." Margaret accepted the assignment and opened the folder to assess the scope of work involved. The intercepted communications were written in a Slavic language she didn't recognize, but the accompanying translations revealed information about NATO operational planning that should have been restricted to the highest security clearance levels. The leaked intelligence included detailed assessments of defensive capabilities and strategic vulnerabilities that could compromise ongoing operations throughout Eastern Europe. "Dr. Hawkins," Margaret said carefully, choosing her words to avoid overstepping her administrative role, "these translations suggest that highly classified NATO intelligence has been compromised. Should this material be flagged for counterintelligence review?" Dr. Hawkins paused, her expression shifting from routine professional interaction to something approaching genuine concern. She had been processing intercepted communications for 15 years and understood the implications of finding allied intelligence in enemy transmissions. The discovery represented a security breach of potentially catastrophic proportions. "You're absolutely right to flag this," Dr. Hawkins replied, lowering her voice to ensure their conversation remained private. "The intelligence described in these intercepts could only have originated from someone with direct access to NATO strategic planning documents. This isn't information that could be obtained through external surveillance or routine intelligence gathering." Margaret felt a surge of validation at having her analytical assessment confirmed by someone with appropriate expertise and authority. Dr. Hawkins' recognition suggested that her pattern analysis had identified genuine security threats rather than administrative anomalies that existed only in her imagination. "I've been tracking some communication irregularities that might be related to this intelligence compromise," Margaret said, accessing her analytical files on the computer screen. "Would you be interested in reviewing the pattern analysis I've developed?" Dr. Hawkins moved closer to Margaret's workstation, studying the spreadsheets and correlation charts that displayed unauthorized communication activities over the previous 6 weeks. Her academic background had provided extensive training in pattern recognition and analytical methodology, giving her the expertise necessary to evaluate Margaret's investigative work. "This is extremely sophisticated analysis," Dr. Hawkins observed, examining the detailed correlation between communication timing and operational briefing schedules. "You've identified a systematic pattern of unauthorized information sharing that appears to be coordinated with specific intelligence gathering objectives." The acknowledgement represented the first professional validation Margaret had received for her analytical approach to administrative duties. Dr. Hawkins' expertise in linguistics and communication analysis provided credibility that Margaret's administrative position couldn't establish independently. "Have you reported these findings through appropriate security channels?" Dr. Hawkins asked, continuing her review of Margaret's documentation. Margaret hesitated before responding, uncertain about the protocol implications of discussing her unauthorized analytical activities with academic personnel. Her investigation had been conducted within the boundaries of her administrative duties, but it had clearly exceeded the analytical scope that was considered appropriate for civilian support staff. "I've been documenting the patterns, but I haven't filed formal reports," Margaret admitted. My administrative position doesn't authorize independent intelligence assessments, and I wasn't sure how to present these findings through proper channels. Dr. Hawkins nodded with understanding that reflected her own experience navigating military bureaucracy as civilian academic personnel. Intelligence organizations operated on hierarchical structures that could discourage valuable contributions from personnel whose formal positions didn't align with their actual expertise and capabilities. Your analysis is too important to be dismissed based on administrative protocols, Dr. Hawkins said firmly. I'm going to recommend that you brief Colonel Martinez directly. She's the counterintelligence coordinator for this facility, and she has the authority to initiate proper investigation of the security concerns you've identified. The prospect of briefing senior military officers about her analytical findings both excited and intimidated Margaret. Her military background provided confidence in her ability to present complex intelligence assessments, but her current civilian status created uncertainties about how her conclusions would be received by active duty personnel. I'd appreciate your support in arranging that briefing, Margaret replied. The pattern analysis speaks for itself, but having academic endorsement would help establish credibility for the findings. Dr. Hawkins spent another 20 minutes reviewing Margaret's documentation, asking detailed questions about methodology and data sources that demonstrated genuine interest in the analytical process. Her questions were informed and insightful, reflecting the kind of intellectual engagement that Margaret had missed since transitioning from military intelligence work to administrative duties. Your correlation analysis is particularly impressive, Dr. Hawkins commented, pointing to a chart that displayed communication timing patterns. You've identified relationships between variables that our automated monitoring systems completely missed. This kind of human pattern recognition is exactly what intelligence analysis requires. The conversation was interrupted by Sandra Williams, who approached Margaret's desk with obvious curiosity about the extended discussion with academic personnel. Sandra's interest in Margaret's assignments had intensified as their apparent importance increased, reflecting office dynamics that valued association with significant work over actual contribution to results. Margaret, is there something I can help coordinate with Dr. Hawkins? Sandra asked, her tone suggesting both helpfulness and curiosity about work that was being conducted outside normal administrative supervision. Dr. Hawkins responded diplomatically, protecting the sensitive nature of Margaret's analytical findings while acknowledging Sandra's administrative authority. We're just reviewing some translation processing procedures, she explained. Margaret's attention to detail has been very helpful with complex linguistic materials. Sandra accepted the explanation without further inquiry, but her expression suggested that she would continue monitoring Margaret's activities for evidence of work that exceeded appropriate administrative boundaries. The interaction reminded Margaret that her investigation would need to be handled carefully to avoid premature exposure that could compromise both her findings and her position within the facility. After Sandra returned to her workstation, Dr. Hawkins completed her review of Margaret's analytical documentation. Her assessment was unequivocally positive, confirming that the pattern analysis had identified genuine security threats that warranted immediate investigation by counterintelligence personnel. I'm going to contact Colonel Martinez this afternoon, Dr. Hawkins promised. Your findings represent the kind of analytical breakthrough that could prevent significant intelligence compromises. The military needs to know about this immediately. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as Dr. Hawkins prepared to escalate her findings through appropriate channels. The validation was gratifying, but it also meant that her analytical activities would soon be subject to official scrutiny by personnel who might question whether administrative staff should be conducting independent intelligence investigations. Thank you for taking this seriously, Margaret said. I know the findings seem significant, but I wasn't sure how to present them through proper channels. Your military experience shows in every aspect of this analysis, Dr. Hawkins replied. You've conducted professional-grade intelligence work that exceeds the capabilities of most analysts I work with. Don't let administrative protocols diminish your confidence in these findings. As Dr. Hawkins gathered the classified materials and prepared to return to her department, Margaret experienced the satisfaction of having her analytical work recognized by someone with appropriate expertise and authority. The pattern she had identified was real, documented, and potentially critical to ongoing security operations. The afternoon continued with routine processing duties that provided cover for completing her analytical documentation. Margaret understood that the next phase of her investigation would involve presenting her findings to senior military personnel, who had the authority to initiate proper counterintelligence operations. Her quiet competence had uncovered a sophisticated security breach that others had missed, and now she faced the challenge of convincing decision-makers that someone they considered just a secretary had identified threats that posed genuine risks to national security operations. The unauthorized communications continued their systematic pattern, but Margaret now had allies who understood the significance of her discoveries. The intelligence compromise she had detected was about to receive the official attention it demanded, regardless of whether her administrative position had authorized the analytical work that made the discovery possible. Colonel Martinez's office occupied a corner position in the secure wing of the building, its reinforced walls lined with maps, organizational charts, and communication equipment that reflected the serious nature of counterintelligence operations. Margaret entered the room at precisely 1400 hours, carrying her leather portfolio and the comprehensive analytical documentation that Dr. Hawkins had endorsed. Just 24 hours earlier, the colonel sat behind a polished mahogany desk that bore the accumulated weight of 3 decades in military intelligence. Her uniform displayed ribbons from operations spanning multiple continents, and her expression carried the focused intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating threats that could compromise national security. She gestured for Margaret to take the chair positioned directly across from her desk, a formal arrangement that emphasized the hierarchical nature of their interaction. Dr. Hawkins tells me you've identified some concerning patterns in our communication systems. Colonel Martinez began, her voice carrying the professional neutrality that characterized senior officers when evaluating potentially sensitive information. I understand you have analytical experience from your military service. Margaret placed her portfolio on her lap and prepared to present the findings that had consumed her attention for the past week. Her military training had taught her to organize complex intelligence briefings with logical progression and supporting evidence. But her current civilian status created uncertainties about how her conclusions would be received by active duty personnel. Yes, ma'am, Margaret replied. I've identified systematic irregularities in communication routing and timing that appear to correlate with unauthorized intelligence sharing. The pattern suggests that classified operational information is being transmitted through channels that bypass normal security monitoring. Colonel Martinez leaned forward slightly, her attention focusing with the intensity that critical intelligence assessments demanded. Her experience in counterintelligence operations had taught her to recognize the difference between routine administrative concerns and genuine security threats, and Margaret's initial presentation suggested something more serious than clerical errors. Show me your analysis, Colonel Martinez instructed, gesturing toward the conference table that occupied one side of her office. I want to see the specific evidence that supports your assessment. Margaret opened her portfolio and spread her analytical materials across the polished surface, organizing charts and spreadsheets with the systematic precision that had characterized her military intelligence work. Her documentation included correlation matrices, timeline analyses, and technical specifications that demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the unauthorized communication activities she had identified. The pattern begins with personnel transfer orders that removed key analysts during critical operational planning phases. Margaret explained, pointing to a chart that displayed staffing changes alongside communication irregularities. These transfers created information gaps that facilitated unauthorized access to classified briefings. Colonel Martinez examined the personnel data with careful attention, cross-referencing names and dates against her own knowledge of recent operational activities. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Margaret noticed increased focus that suggested genuine interest in the analytical findings. "Continue," Colonel Martinez said, making notes on a legal pad that remained positioned outside Margaret's view. "The unauthorized communications use encryption signatures that don't match standard military protocols." Margaret continued, displaying technical analysis that she had developed through careful examination of intercept logs. The transmission frequencies and modulation patterns suggest that the equipment has been modified to avoid detection by automated monitoring systems. The technical specifications represented the most sophisticated aspect of Margaret's investigation, requiring detailed understanding of communication, equipment, and encryption methodologies that exceeded the typical knowledge base of administrative personnel. Colonel Martinez's expression shifted to something approaching genuine surprise as she reviewed the complexity of Margaret's analytical work. "Where did you acquire the technical expertise to conduct this level of communication analysis?" Colonel Martinez asked, her tone suggesting professional curiosity rather than skepticism about Margaret's qualifications. "My military intelligence training included specialized courses in signal analysis and communication security," Margaret replied. "I served as a senior analyst in units that conducted counterintelligence operations in Afghanistan and Eastern Europe." Colonel Martinez nodded with understanding that reflected her own experience with military personnel, whose expertise often exceeded their current job descriptions. The transition from active duty to civilian employment frequently resulted in underutilization of valuable skills and knowledge that had been developed through years of specialized training. "Your analysis is impressively thorough," Colonel Martinez observed, continuing her review of Margaret's documentation. "But these are serious allegations that would require significant investigative resources to verify. Are you certain about the correlation between communication irregularities and unauthorized intelligence sharing?" The question challenged Margaret to defend her analytical conclusions against the institutional skepticism that typically greeted intelligence assessments from unexpected sources. Her military experience had taught her to anticipate such challenges and prepare evidence that could withstand rigorous scrutiny from senior personnel. "The correlation is supported by multiple independent data sources," Margaret replied, displaying additional charts that strengthened her case. "The timing patterns are too consistent to be coincidental, and the technical characteristics clearly indicate deliberate circumvention of security protocols." Colonel Martinez spent the next 15 minutes examining Margaret's evidence with the careful attention that counterintelligence assessments demanded. Her questions were informed and probing, reflecting extensive experience in evaluating threats that could compromise operational security. Margaret answered each inquiry with detailed explanations that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of the analytical methodology she had employed. This analysis suggests a sophisticated intelligence operation that has been active for several weeks, Colonel Martinez concluded, closing the final folder of evidence. "If your assessment is accurate, we're dealing with a security breach that poses significant risks to ongoing operations." The acknowledgement represented validation of Margaret's analytical work, but it also established the serious implications of her discoveries. Colonel Martinez's recognition meant that the unauthorized communication activities would receive official investigation by counterintelligence personnel with appropriate authority and resources. "What action do you recommend, ma'am?" Margaret asked, seeking guidance about her role in the investigative process that would follow. Colonel Martinez paused before responding, considering the protocol implications of involving civilian administrative personnel and counterintelligence operations. Her decision would need to balance operational security requirements with recognition of Margaret's analytical contributions to the investigation. Your findings warrant immediate investigation, Colonel Martinez said finally. However, I need to be direct about the challenges we face in proceeding with this case. Your analytical work is excellent, but your administrative position creates credibility issues that could complicate official proceedings. The admission stung because it acknowledged the institutional biases that Margaret had feared would undermine her findings. Her military experience and analytical expertise were being discounted because her current civilian status didn't align with expectations about who should be conducting intelligence assessments. I understand the protocol concerns, Margaret replied carefully. But the evidence speaks for itself, regardless of who compiled it. The security breach is real and ongoing. I agree completely, Colonel Martinez said, her tone suggesting genuine respect for Margaret's work despite the institutional constraints they both faced. The problem is that any official investigation will need to be justified through channels that may question why administrative personnel were conducting independent intelligence analysis. The conversation was interrupted by Margaret's supervisor, Major Harrison, who entered Colonel Martinez's office without knocking. His expression suggested irritation about discovering that Margaret was meeting with senior officers without his knowledge or approval. The breach of administrative protocol reflected broader tensions about civilian staff autonomy and supervisory oversight. Colonel Martinez, I apologize for interrupting, Major Harrison said, his voice carrying undertones of displeasure. I wasn't aware that Chen had been authorized to brief you on administrative matters. If there are concerns about her work quality, they should be addressed through proper supervisory channels. Colonel Martinez's response was diplomatically firm, protecting Margaret while acknowledging Major Harrison's legitimate supervisory concerns. Ms. Chen has provided valuable analytical support for a counterintelligence assessment, she explained. Her findings have significant operational implications that require immediate investigation. Major Harrison's expression shifted from irritation to confusion as he processed the implications of Colonel Martinez's statement. His understanding of Margaret's duties had been limited to routine administrative processing, and the suggestion that she had been conducting analytical work exceeded his expectations about her role and capabilities. With respect, Colonel Chen is assigned to administrative duties that don't include intelligence analysis, Major Harrison said, his tone becoming more formal as he addressed the apparent violation of established protocols. If there are analytical requirements, they should be handled by personnel with appropriate clearances and qualifications. The confrontation embodied exactly the institutional resistance that Margaret had anticipated when considering whether to report her findings through official channels. Major Harrison's objections reflected systemic assumptions about the capabilities and appropriate duties of civilian administrative personnel. Major Harrison, Colonel Martinez replied with authority that ended further discussion. Ms. Chen's military intelligence background qualifies her to conduct the analytical work she has presented. Her findings indicate a serious security breach that requires immediate attention, regardless of current job classification protocols. Major Harrison accepted the colonel's directive without further argument, but his expression suggested that Margaret would face consequences for exceeding her administrative authority. The institutional dynamics that govern civilian staff relationships with military personnel had been disrupted by her independent analytical activities. After Major Harrison left the office, Colonel Martinez returned her attention to Margaret's findings with renewed focus. The interruption had highlighted the bureaucratic obstacles that could complicate official investigation of the security concerns, but it had also demonstrated her commitment to pursuing the case despite administrative resistance. I'm going to initiate a formal counterintelligence investigation based on your analysis, Colonel Martinez announced. However, your continued involvement will need to be handled carefully to avoid further supervisory conflicts. Are you prepared to support this investigation despite potential career consequences? Margaret considered the question seriously, understanding that her decision would determine whether the security breach she had identified would receive appropriate investigation or be dismissed due to institutional politics and protocol concerns. "Yes, ma'am," Margaret replied without hesitation. The security implications are too serious to ignore because of administrative complications. Colonel Martinez nodded with approval that suggested respect for Margaret's professional courage and commitment to national security objectives. The investigation would proceed, but both women understood that the path forward would require navigating institutional resistance that could undermine their efforts to address genuine threats to operational security. The following morning brought an atmosphere of careful tension to Margaret's workstation as she navigated the delicate balance between maintaining her official administrative duties and supporting Colonel Martinez's counterintelligence investigation. Major Harrison had made his displeasure clear through a series of pointed assignments designed to keep her occupied with routine tasks that left minimal time for analytical activities. His strategy was transparent but effective, creating administrative barriers that limited her access to the classified materials necessary for continued investigation. Margaret adapted by developing more sophisticated methods for gathering intelligence within the constraints of her official role. Each document that crossed her desk was processed with enhanced attention to details that might support the ongoing investigation, while her routine filing duties provided opportunities to cross-reference information across multiple departments. Without attracting supervisory attention, the breakthrough came during her processing of routine maintenance logs for the facility's communication equipment. Hidden within the technical specifications and service records, she discovered evidence that several communication terminals had been modified with hardware that wasn't part of standard military inventory. The modifications were subtle, involving frequency modulation capabilities that would enable the unauthorized transmissions she had identified in her original analysis. Her discovery was documented carefully in her personal notes, but she faced the challenge of communicating the findings to Colonel Martinez without violating Major Harrison's directive to limit her contact with senior officers. The institutional barriers that had been erected to contain her investigation required creative solutions that didn't technically violate the administrative protocols that governed her position. During her lunch break, Margaret walked to the building's public computer terminal and composed a detailed technical memorandum that outlined her findings about the communication equipment modifications. The memorandum was formatted as a maintenance concern report, using official terminology that would be appropriate for administrative personnel to submit through established channels. She printed the document and placed it in the routine correspondence folder that would be delivered to Colonel Martinez's office as part of the daily administrative mail distribution. The subterfuge felt necessary but uncomfortable, requiring her to operate within gray areas of institutional protocol that challenged her preference for direct communication and transparent procedures. Military training had emphasized the importance of clear reporting relationships and official channels, but her current situation demanded flexibility that tested those principles. Around 2 o'clock, Dr. Hawkins approached Margaret's desk with another translation assignment, but her true purpose was to provide updates about the investigation's progress that couldn't be communicated through official channels. The academic's position outside the military hierarchy gave her more freedom to interact with Margaret without triggering additional supervisory scrutiny. "The translation work you processed last week has generated significant interest among senior personnel," Dr. Hawkins said quietly, placing a folder on Margaret's desk while speaking in codes that would be meaningless to casual observers but clear to someone familiar with the investigation. Additional linguistic analysis may be required as the project develops. Margaret understood that Colonel Martinez had begun preliminary investigation of the security concerns, but that progress was being complicated by the institutional resistance she had anticipated. The coded communication indicated that her continued analytical support would be necessary, but would need to be conducted through indirect methods that avoided further confrontation with administrative supervisors. "I'm prepared to provide whatever linguistic support the project requires," Margaret replied, using similar coded language to confirm her willingness to continue supporting the investigation despite the administrative obstacles that had been constructed to limit her involvement. Dr. Hawkins nodded with understanding and gathered the translation materials, but she lingered near Margaret's desk long enough to provide additional guidance about the investigation's direction. "The project timeline has been accelerated due to operational concerns," she said meaningfully. "Comprehensive analysis may be required sooner than originally anticipated." The message suggested that the unauthorized intelligence sharing was continuing and potentially escalating, creating urgency that demanded more aggressive investigative methods. Margaret's original analysis had identified the pattern of security breaches, but ongoing activities indicated that the threat was active and growing rather than historical and contained. After Dr. Hawkins left, Margaret returned to her routine duties with renewed determination to gather additional evidence while operating within the constraints that had been imposed on her activities. Her afternoon assignments included processing personnel records for the communications department, providing access to information about staff members who had authorized access to the equipment that had been modified for unauthorized transmissions. Personnel files revealed concerning patterns of security, clearance upgrades, and duty assignments that correlated with the timeline of unauthorized communication activities. 3 communications technicians had received expanded access privileges during the exact period when the equipment modifications had been implemented, suggesting coordination between personnel management and technical preparation for intelligence operations. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Margaret's analysis expanded to include financial records that were accessible through her administrative duties, revealing expense reports and procurement activities that supported her suspicions about systematic preparation for unauthorized intelligence gathering. Equipment purchases had been made through routine maintenance budgets, using procedures that avoided the scrutiny that would accompany special procurement requests. The financial evidence strengthened her case significantly, providing documentation of deliberate preparation for intelligence operations that went far beyond opportunistic exploitation of security vulnerabilities. The unauthorized communication activities represented a planned, coordinated effort that had been months in development and was being executed by personnel with appropriate technical expertise and security clearances. Around 4 o'clock, Lieutenant Colonel Stevens approached Margaret's desk with what appeared to be a routine assignment, but was actually an opportunity to provide her with additional classified materials that could support the ongoing investigation. His involvement suggested that Colonel Martinez had begun recruiting allies within the intelligence community who recognized the significance of Margaret's discoveries. "Chen, I have some additional intercept logs that require priority processing," Stevens said, placing a classified folder beside her keyboard. "The material is highly sensitive and requires your specific attention to detail." Margaret accepted the assignment and opened the folder to discover intercepted communications that contained references to upcoming operational briefings and NATO strategic planning sessions. The intelligence being shared through unauthorized channels was current and strategically significant, confirming that the security breach was ongoing and posed immediate risks to allied operations. The intercept logs included technical metadata that provided additional evidence about the modified communication equipment Margaret had identified earlier. The transmission signatures matched the specifications she had documented, confirming that her analysis had correctly identified the methods being used for unauthorized intelligence sharing. More troubling, the intercepted communications contained references to American personnel by name and position, suggesting that the unauthorized intelligence sharing was being coordinated by someone with detailed knowledge of military organizational structures and personnel assignments. The level of operational detail indicated that the security breach involved personnel with significant access to classified information and decision-making processes. Margaret processed the intercept logs with careful attention to details that supported her expanding understanding of the intelligence operation. Each piece of evidence strengthened her case while revealing the sophisticated nature of the security threat that had been operating undetected within the facility's communication systems. Her documentation methods had become more sophisticated as well, utilizing multiple backup systems and secure storage methods that would preserve the evidence even if her primary analytical files were compromised or confiscated. Military training had taught her to prepare for scenarios where critical intelligence might be suppressed for political or administrative reasons. The afternoon concluded with Margaret's completion of comprehensive analytical documentation that connected the personnel patterns, equipment modifications, financial evidence, and intercepted communications into a coherent assessment of the security threat. Her findings painted a picture of systematic intelligence compromise that exceeded her original concerns and demanded immediate counterintelligence action. As the day shift ended, Margaret secured her analytical materials and prepared for what she suspected would be a crucial phase of the investigation. Colonel Martinez had the evidence necessary to justify formal counterintelligence operations, but the institutional resistance she had encountered suggested that bureaucratic obstacles might still prevent appropriate action. Her quiet persistence had uncovered a security breach of significant proportions. But the challenge now involved convincing military leadership that the threat was real and immediate, despite originating from analytical work conducted by someone whose administrative position wasn't supposed to include intelligence assessment. Responsibilities. The unauthorized communications continued their systematic pattern, but Margaret now had allies within the intelligence community who understood the significance of her discoveries. The security breach she had detected was about to receive the official attention it demanded, assuming that institutional politics and administrative protocols didn't prevent appropriate action. Her military experience had taught her that some of the most important battles were fought not against external enemies, but against internal resistance to uncomfortable truths. The intelligence operation she had uncovered challenged assumptions about security, procedures, and personnel reliability that senior officers might prefer not to confront. Margaret understood that the next phase of the investigation would test not only her analytical findings, but also her ability to navigate institutional dynamics that could determine whether her discoveries resulted in effective counterintelligence action or bureaucratic suppression of inconvenient evidence. The quiet competence that had enabled her to detect the security breach would now be tested against organizational forces that might value administrative stability over operational security. Her persistence had brought critical intelligence to light, but ensuring appropriate action would require additional courage and strategic thinking that went beyond analytical expertise. The secure conference room in the basement of Building C had been designed for discussions that couldn't risk electronic surveillance or unauthorized access. Its reinforced walls contained no windows, and the electronic countermeasure equipment hummed quietly in the background, creating a sterile environment where sensitive intelligence could be discussed without fear of compromise. Margaret entered the room at 0600 hours, 2 hours before her official duty time, carrying only a notebook and the weight of a decision that could define the remainder of her career. Colonel Martinez waited at the head of the polished conference table, flanked by 2 officers Margaret didn't recognize. Their uniforms bore the distinctive insignia of Defense Intelligence Agency personnel, suggesting that her findings had attracted attention from investigative authorities beyond the local facility. The presence of outside investigators confirmed that the security breach she had identified was being taken seriously at the highest levels of military intelligence. "Miss Chen," Colonel Martinez began formally, "I want you to meet Agent Rebecca Torres from DIA Counterintelligence and Major David Kim from the Inspector General's office. They're here to evaluate the evidence you've compiled and determine the scope of the security investigation that may be required." Margaret took her assigned seat and opened her notebook to the summary page she had prepared for this briefing. The documentation represented weeks of careful analysis and systematic evidence gathering, but she understood that the next hour would determine whether her findings resulted in official action or administrative dismissal. Agent Torres leaned forward with the focused intensity that characterized professional investigators evaluating potentially critical intelligence. Her civilian status within the military hierarchy gave her perspective that differed from the institutional concerns that might influence uniformed personnel. "We've reviewed your preliminary analysis through Colonel Martinez," Agent Torres said, her voice carrying the neutral professionalism that investigators used when evaluating sensitive information. "Your findings suggest a coordinated intelligence operation that has been active for several months. We need to understand how you identified this pattern when our automated monitoring systems failed to detect any irregularities." The question challenged Margaret to explain her analytical methodology while defending the credibility of conclusions that contradicted official security assessments. Her military training had prepared her for such scrutiny, but her current civilian status created additional pressure to justify analytical work that exceeded her administrative authority. "My approach focused on correlation analysis between seemingly unrelated data sources," Margaret explained, displaying charts that showed the connections she had identified between personnel transfers, communication timing, and equipment modifications. Automated systems monitor individual parameters, but they're not designed to recognize patterns that span multiple departments and timeframes. Major Kim examined her documentation with careful attention to methodology and evidence quality. His position with the Inspector General's office meant that he would evaluate both the substance of her findings and the procedural issues raised by civilian personnel conducting unauthorized intelligence analysis. "Your correlation matrices are impressively sophisticated," Major Kim observed, studying spreadsheets that displayed complex relationships between variables. "This level of analysis typically requires specialized training and analytical software. How did you develop these capabilities?" Margaret's response required careful balance between demonstrating her qualifications and avoiding any suggestion that she had exceeded appropriate boundaries in conducting her investigation. The institutional dynamics surrounding her case demanded strategic presentation of her background and expertise. "My military intelligence training included advanced courses in pattern recognition and analytical methodology," Margaret replied. "The techniques I used are standard approaches that I adapted to work within the constraints of civilian administrative systems." Agent Torres spent several minutes reviewing the technical evidence about communication equipment modifications, asking detailed questions that tested Margaret's understanding of the hardware and software capabilities involved in the unauthorized transmissions. Her inquiries were informed and probing, reflecting extensive experience in investigating sophisticated intelligence operations. "The equipment modifications you've identified represent significant technical expertise," Agent Torres noted. "Someone with authorized access to our communication systems deliberately installed hardware that would enable covert transmissions. This suggests insider involvement at a level that poses serious security risks." The acknowledgement validated Margaret's most serious concerns about the scope and sophistication of the intelligence operation. Agent Torres' recognition meant that the security breach involved personnel with legitimate access to classified systems, making detection and investigation particularly challenging. Colonel Martinez provided additional context about the operational implications of Margaret's findings. The intercepted communications contain references to NATO strategic planning and allied intelligence, assessments that could compromise ongoing operations throughout Eastern Europe. The security breach has potential consequences that extend far beyond this facility. Major Kim's questions focused on the procedural aspects of Margaret's investigation, examining how she had gathered evidence while maintaining her official administrative duties. His concerns reflected institutional priorities about proper channels and authorized analytical activities. Ms. Chen, your investigation was conducted without supervisory approval or official authorization, Major Kim stated, his tone suggesting concern rather than accusation. While your findings appear significant, the methods you used raise questions about proper protocol and chain of command procedures. Margaret had anticipated this challenge and prepared responses that acknowledged procedural concerns while emphasizing the critical nature of her discoveries. Her defense required demonstrating that the security breach was too serious to be delayed by administrative protocols. I understand the procedural concerns, Margaret replied carefully. However, the pattern one identified indicated ongoing intelligence compromise that posed immediate risks to operational security. I documented everything carefully and reported my findings through appropriate channels as soon as I had sufficient evidence to support my assessment. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes as the investigators examined every aspect of Margaret's analytical work. Their questions tested her methodology, challenged her conclusions, and evaluated the credibility of evidence that had been gathered through unconventional means. Margaret answered each inquiry with detailed explanations that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of the intelligence operation she had uncovered. Agent Torres concluded her evaluation with a direct assessment of Margaret's findings. Your analysis identifies a sophisticated intelligence operation that poses significant risks to national security. The evidence you've compiled supports immediate counterintelligence action, regardless of the procedural issues surrounding how it was obtained. The validation represented professional recognition of Margaret's analytical work, but it also established the serious implications of her discoveries. Agent Torres' endorsement meant that the unauthorized intelligence sharing would receive official investigation by personnel with appropriate authority and resources. Major Kim's assessment was more cautious, reflecting institutional concerns about precedent and protocol. The substance of Ms. Chen's analysis appears sound, but we need to address the procedural issues to ensure that future investigations follow proper channels. Her methods, while effective, can't be allowed to establish precedent for unauthorized analytical activities by administrative personnel. Colonel Martinez responded diplomatically, balancing recognition of Margaret's contributions with acknowledgement of legitimate institutional concerns. Ms. Chen's military intelligence background provided qualifications that her current administrative position doesn't fully utilize. Her analytical work in this case represents expertise that we should be leveraging more effectively rather than restricting through rigid protocol interpretations. The discussion shifted to planning the counterintelligence operation that would investigate and neutralize the security breach Margaret had identified. Agent Torres outlined investigative procedures that would include surveillance of suspected personnel, technical analysis of communication equipment, and coordination with allied intelligence services that might have been affected by the unauthorized information sharing. We'll need Ms. Chen's continued analytical support throughout the investigation, Agent Torres announced. Her understanding of the pattern and access to relevant administrative records make her essential to the operational team. However, her involvement will need to be formalized through appropriate channels to address the protocol concerns that have been raised. Major Kim nodded with reluctant agreement, recognizing that Margaret's expertise was necessary for successful investigation despite the institutional complications her case had created. We can arrange temporary assignment that would authorize her analytical activities while maintaining proper supervisory oversight. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as the investigators concluded their evaluation. The validation was gratifying, but she understood that her role in the investigation would expose her to additional scrutiny and potential career consequences if the operation encountered complications or political resistance. "I'm prepared to provide whatever analytical support the investigation requires," Margaret stated. "The security implications are too serious to be compromised by administrative concerns or personal considerations." Agent Torres gathered the evidence files and prepared to initiate the formal counterintelligence investigation. "We'll begin surveillance operations immediately while developing the technical analysis necessary to neutralize the communication. Modifications. This case has priority designation, which means we have full authority to pursue all investigative leads regardless of institutional politics." As the meeting concluded, Margaret understood that her quiet persistence had succeeded in bringing critical security concerns to official attention. The intelligence operation she had detected through careful analysis of routine administrative materials was about to face professional counterintelligence investigation by personnel with appropriate authority and resources. The decision to risk her career by pursuing unauthorized analytical activities had been vindicated by investigators who recognized the significance of her discoveries. However, the institutional dynamics that had initially resisted her findings suggested that future challenges would require continued courage and strategic thinking beyond her analytical expertise. The security breach continued its systematic operation. But Margaret now had allies within the intelligence community who understood the threat and possessed the authority necessary to take effective action. Her transformation from dismissed administrative personnel to essential investigative asset had been completed through demonstrated competence and professional courage that overcame institutional bias and bureaucratic resistance. The surveillance operation began at dawn on a Tuesday morning when Margaret arrived at her workstation to find Agent Torres seated at the vacant desk beside her own, disguised as a temporary administrative assistant conducting routine file organization. The undercover arrangement provided Torres with direct access to the administrative environment while maintaining the appearance of normal office operations that wouldn't alert potential security threats to the ongoing investigation. Margaret's role had been officially redesignated as analytical consultant through emergency protocols that bypassed normal administrative procedures. The temporary assignment gave her authorized access to classified materials and direct reporting relationships with counterintelligence personnel, eliminating the institutional barriers that had previously constrained her investigative activities. The transformation was subtle but significant. Her security badge now displayed additional access privileges. Her computer terminal had been upgraded with analytical software that rivaled systems used by professional intelligence analysts, and her desk had been relocated to a position that provided optimal observation of personnel who had been identified as potential security risks. Torres maintained her administrative cover through careful attention to routine filing duties while simultaneously monitoring communication activities and personnel behavior patterns. The arrangement required sophisticated coordination to ensure that surveillance activities remained undetected while gathering evidence necessary for successful prosecution of the intelligence operation. The communication irregularities you identified have accelerated over the past week, Torres reported quietly during a morning coffee break that provided cover for operational discussions. Someone is preparing for a major intelligence transfer, possibly in response to sensing that their activities are under scrutiny. Margaret reviewed her updated analytical charts, which showed increased frequency of unauthorized transmissions coinciding with several high-priority NATO briefings scheduled for the following week. The timing suggested that the intelligence operation was targeting specific strategic information that would be particularly valuable to hostile intelligence services. The pattern indicates they're planning to compromise the Eastern European defense assessment that's being finalized this week, Margaret observed, pointing to correlation data that connected communication timing with briefing schedules. That information could undermine Allied defensive capabilities throughout the Baltic region. Torres nodded with grim understanding of the operational implications. Her experience in counterintelligence operations had taught her to recognize the critical moments when ongoing surveillance needed to transition to active intervention to prevent irreversible security compromises. Around 10 o'clock, Margaret noticed unusual activity around the communication equipment room where she had previously identified unauthorized hardware modifications. Technical Sergeant William Rodriguez, one of the communications specialists who had received expanded access privileges during the suspicious timeframe, was conducting what appeared to be routine maintenance, but was accessing systems that weren't part of his normal duties. Torres observed Rodriguez's activities through the administrative area's security cameras while Margaret monitored his access patterns through the computer terminal logs. Their combined surveillance revealed that Rodriguez was preparing communication equipment for a major transmission session that would occur outside normal operational hours. He's configuring the modified terminals for extended session capability, Margaret reported, analyzing the technical parameters that Rodriguez was adjusting. The frequency settings match the unauthorized transmission signatures I documented in my original analysis. Torres activated a discrete communication device that connected her directly to the operational command center, where Major Kim and Colonel Martinez were coordinating the broader investigation. Target Alpha is preparing for major communication session. Recommend immediate technical surveillance and preparation for interdiction operations. The response was immediate and decisive. Additional counterintelligence personnel began positioning themselves throughout the facility, using cover identities that wouldn't attract attention from potential security threats while providing comprehensive surveillance of all personnel who had been identified as possible participants in the intelligence operation. Margaret's analytical work had evolved from pattern recognition to real-time operational support, providing intelligence assessments that guided tactical decisions by professional counterintelligence operatives. Her transformation from administrative clerk to essential team member was complete, validated by the critical nature of her contributions to the ongoing investigation. During the lunch break, Torres received confirmation that technical analysis had identified the specific personnel responsible for modifying the communication equipment. The investigation had expanded to include Staff Sergeant Maria Fernandez from the IT Security Department and civilian contractor James Mitchell from the Facilities Management Team, both of whom had coordinated their activities to create comprehensive access to classified communication systems. We have a 3-person network with complementary technical capabilities, Torres briefed Margaret privately. Rodriguez handles communication operations, Fernandez manages security bypass procedures, and Mitchell provides physical access to restricted areas. Their coordination indicates sophisticated planning and professional-level intelligence training. Margaret reviewed personnel files for the 3 suspects, identifying additional patterns that supported the counterintelligence assessment. All 3 had received duty assignments that provided access to different aspects of the facility's communication infrastructure, and their work schedules had been coordinated to ensure overlapping coverage of critical operational periods. Their duty rotations were arranged to provide 24-hour access to the modified communication systems, Margaret observed, displaying scheduling analysis that revealed deliberate coordination. Someone with administrative authority helped orchestrate their assignments to facilitate ongoing intelligence operations. The implication was troubling because it suggested that the security breach included personnel with supervisory authority who had been instrumental in positioning the operational team for maximum effectiveness. Torres recognized that the investigation might need to expand beyond the 3 identified suspects to include whoever had coordinated their assignments and provided operational guidance. Around 3 o'clock, the surveillance operation detected Rodriguez initiating preparation procedures for the major communication session that had been anticipated based on his morning activities. Technical monitoring revealed that he was coordinating with external contacts to establish communication windows that would enable extended intelligence transmission outside normal monitoring periods. Margaret's real-time analysis provided tactical intelligence that guided counterintelligence positioning for the interdiction operation. Her understanding of the communication timing patterns enabled investigators to predict when the unauthorized transmission would occur and prepare appropriate technical countermeasures. The transmission window opens at 18:30 hours. Margaret reported, analyzing Rodriguez's preparation activities. He's configured the system for maximum data throughput, suggesting they plan to transfer significant intelligence volumes during a single session. Torres coordinated with the tactical team to ensure that interdiction operations would capture both the transmission activities and the intelligence materials being shared with unauthorized recipients. The timing was critical because premature intervention could alert other participants, while delayed action might allow successful completion of the intelligence transfer. At 1700 hours, Major Kim arrived in the administrative area to observe the final phases of the surveillance operation. His presence indicated that senior leadership was personally monitoring the case that had originated with Margaret's analytical work and had evolved into a significant counterintelligence operation. Ms. Chen, your analytical contributions have been essential to this investigation, Major Kim acknowledged. The pattern recognition work you conducted independently has enabled us to identify and neutralize a sophisticated intelligence operation that could have compromised critical national security information. The recognition represented professional validation that exceeded Margaret's expectations when she had first begun documenting communication irregularities that others dismissed as administrative anomalies. Her quiet persistence had uncovered genuine security threats and earned recognition from senior intelligence professionals. As the 1830 transmission window approached, counterintelligence personnel positioned themselves to observe and record all activities related to the unauthorized communication session. Margaret monitored the technical parameters while Torres coordinated with tactical teams that would conduct simultaneous arrests of all 3 suspects. The unauthorized transmission began precisely at 1830 hours, confirming Margaret's analytical predictions about timing and operational procedures. Rodriguez initiated communication protocols that connected the modified equipment to external receivers, while Fernandez disabled security monitoring systems that would normally detect unauthorized transmissions. We have active transmission of classified materials, Torres reported to the Operational Command Center. All suspects are participating in coordinated intelligence sharing that confirms the assessment provided by our analytical consultant. Margaret watched the culmination of weeks of investigation as counterintelligence personnel moved to arrest the 3 suspects while they were actively engaged in unauthorized intelligence transmission. The evidence would be comprehensive and undeniable, ensuring successful prosecution of the security breach that had been operating undetected for months. The arrests were conducted simultaneously across multiple locations within the facility, preventing any opportunity for coordination or evidence destruction by the suspects. Rodriguez was apprehended while actively transmitting classified NATO intelligence to unauthorized recipients, providing definitive proof of the security breach that Margaret had first identified through careful analysis of routine administrative materials. Torres coordinated the evidence collection process while Margaret documented the technical parameters of the unauthorized transmission for subsequent legal proceedings. Her analytical work would be essential to prosecution efforts that would demonstrate the scope and significance of the FUESA intelligence compromise. The operation concluded with comprehensive evidence of systematic intelligence sharing that had compromised critical national security information over a period of several months. Margaret's transformation from dismissed administrative clerk to essential counterintelligence asset was complete, validated by the successful neutralization of security threats that had been invisible to automated monitoring systems but detectable through human analytical expertise. The facility's main briefing auditorium had been transformed for the morning's all-hands assembly, its normally austere atmosphere elevated by the presence of senior officers whose ribbons and insignia reflected decades of distinguished service across multiple theaters of operation. Margaret entered through the rear entrance, her civilian attire now complemented by a temporary security badge that displayed analytical consultant credentials. Alongside her photograph and clearance level indicators, the assembled personnel represented every department within the intelligence facility, from senior analysts and operational commanders to administrative staff and technical specialists, who rarely gathered in the same space. The unusual nature of the assembly had generated considerable speculation about its purpose, though strict operational security protocols had prevented advance disclosure of the agenda or speakers. Admiral Patricia Kellerman approached the podium with the measured authority that characterized flag officers addressing matters of institutional significance. Her uniform displayed decorations from intelligence operations spanning 3 decades, and her presence indicated that Margaret's case had attracted attention at the highest levels of military intelligence leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Kellerman began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the packed auditorium, "we are here today to recognize exceptional analytical work that prevented a significant compromise of national security information. The case I will describe demonstrates the critical importance of human judgment in complementing our automated security systems." Margaret remained in her assigned seat near the middle of the auditorium, surrounded by colleagues whose attitudes toward her had undergone dramatic transformation since the successful conclusion of the counterintelligence operation. Officers who had previously dismissed her administrative contributions now regarded her with professional respect that reflected recognition of her analytical expertise. 3 weeks ago, civilian analyst Margaret Chen identified communication irregularities that our sophisticated monitoring systems had failed to detect. Admiral Kellerman continued, her presentation outlining the investigation's progression from initial pattern recognition through successful interdiction of unauthorized intelligence sharing. Her analytical work uncovered a coordinated espionage operation that had been active for 6 months. The detailed briefing that followed revealed the full scope of the security breach that Margaret's investigation had exposed. The 3 arrested suspects had been sharing classified NATO intelligence with foreign handlers, using communication methods specifically designed to avoid detection by automated security systems. Their operation had compromised strategic assessments, personnel information, and operational planning that affected Allied security throughout Eastern Europe. Dr. Hawkins, seated in the front row among the academic staff, nodded with satisfaction. As Admiral Kellerman described Margaret's methodical approach to pattern recognition and evidence compilation, her early support for Margaret's analytical work had proven instrumental in ensuring that the security concerns received appropriate official attention despite institutional resistance. The intelligence compromise involved classified materials from 17 separate briefings, Admiral Kellerman explained, displaying charts that showed the extensive scope of unauthorized information sharing. The operation was neutralized before critical strategic assessments could be transmitted to hostile intelligence services, preventing potential compromise of Allied defensive capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, who had provided Margaret with crucial classified materials during her investigation, listened with professional interest as the briefing outlined analytical techniques that would be incorporated into standard counterintelligence training programs. His recognition of Margaret's expertise had contributed to the investigation's success by ensuring she had access to relevant intelligence materials. Colonel Martinez rose from her position among the senior staff to provide additional context about the investigation's operational significance. Ms. Chen's analytical work identified patterns that required sophisticated understanding of communication systems, intelligence operations, and counterintelligence methodology. Her military background provided qualifications that enabled her to conduct professional-grade analysis that exceeded the capabilities of automated monitoring systems. The acknowledgement represented institutional recognition that Margaret's expertise had been underutilized by her administrative assignment, and that her analytical capabilities warranted more appropriate professional positioning. Colonel Martinez's endorsement carried weight within the intelligence community that would influence future career opportunities, and professional recognition that Major Kim approached the podium to address the procedural aspects of Margaret's case, acknowledging the institutional challenges that had complicated official response to her findings. Ms. Chen's investigation was conducted initially without formal authorization, reflecting limitations in our procedures for recognizing and utilizing analytical expertise among civilian personnel. His presentation outlined policy changes that would create formal mechanisms for civilian employees to report analytical findings and receive appropriate evaluation of their contributions to intelligence operations. The procedural modifications represented institutional learning that would prevent similar cases from being dismissed due to administrative protocol limitations. Effective immediately, Major Kim announced, "We are establishing an analytical assessment program that will provide formal channels for civilian personnel to contribute specialized expertise to intelligence operations. This program will ensure that valuable analytical capabilities are recognized and utilized regardless of current job classification." Margaret felt a mixture of validation and relief as she listened to policy changes that would prevent other analysts from facing the institutional resistance she had encountered. The program represented systemic recognition that analytical expertise could emerge from unexpected sources and deserved official evaluation based on competency rather than administrative position. Agent Torres took the podium to describe the technical aspects of the espionage operation that Margaret's investigation had uncovered. The suspects used sophisticated communication modifications that required professional-level technical expertise and coordinated operational planning. Their methods were specifically designed to exploit gaps in automated monitoring systems that rely on predictable patterns and standard protocols. The technical briefing emphasized how Margaret's human analytical approach had succeeded where electronic systems had failed, identifying subtle correlations and irregular patterns that automated monitoring had dismissed as background noise. Her success demonstrated the continued importance of human expertise in complementing technological capabilities. Ms. Chen's analytical methodology will be incorporated into our training programs for intelligence analysts throughout the Department of Defense, Agent Torres announced. Her techniques for identifying complex patterns across multiple data sources represent best practices that will enhance our counterintelligence capabilities. The institutionalization of Margaret's analytical methods represented the highest form of professional recognition, ensuring that her contributions would influence intelligence operations far beyond the immediate case. Her transformation from dismissed administrative clerk to recognized analytical expert was complete, validated by adoption of her techniques as standard methodology. Admiral Kellerman returned to the podium for the ceremony's conclusion, calling Margaret forward to receive formal recognition for her contributions to national security. The walk to the front of the auditorium took her past colleagues, who had previously questioned her methods, and supervisors who had attempted to constrain her analytical activities. "Miss Chen," Admiral Kellerman said as Margaret joined her at the podium, "your analytical work exemplifies the highest standards of professional competence and dedication to national security. Your persistence in pursuing difficult questions, when others had moved on to easier answers, prevented significant compromise of classified intelligence." The formal commendation presented to Margaret included recognition of her analytical expertise, citation for exceptional service to national security, and authorization for permanent assignment to analytical duties that would utilize her specialized capabilities. The document represented institutional acknowledgement that her contributions warranted professional recognition and appropriate career positioning. Major Harrison, who had initially attempted to limit Margaret's analytical activities, was among the officers who approached her after the ceremony to offer congratulations and professional recognition. His acknowledgement represented personal recognition of analytical expertise that his administrative concerns had failed to appreciate. "Margaret, your work on this case was exceptional," Major Harrison said, his tone reflecting genuine respect rather than the dismissive attitude that had characterized their previous interactions. "I should have recognized your analytical capabilities and provided more support for your investigative activities." The conversation represented closure on the institutional resistance that had complicated Margaret's investigation, but more importantly, it demonstrated systemic recognition that analytical expertise deserved support regardless of its source or the administrative protocols that might initially constrain its expression. Sandra Williams and Jennifer Martinez, who had previously criticized Margaret's attention to detail and analytical approach to administrative duties, waited respectfully for opportunities to offer congratulations and professional recognition. Their changed attitudes reflected broader institutional transformation in how civilian analytical contributions were perceived and valued. "We never understood what you were really doing," Sandra admitted, her tone reflecting genuine recognition of expertise she had previously dismissed. "Your attention to detail wasn't administrative perfectionism, it was professional intelligence. Analysis that none of us recognized." The acknowledgement represented personal vindication for Margaret, but more importantly, it demonstrated that institutional attitudes could change when presented with undeniable evidence of competence and professional value. Her quiet persistence had overcome skepticism through demonstrated results rather than confrontational arguments. As the assembly concluded and personnel returned to their normal duties, Margaret remained at the podium with Admiral Kellerman and Colonel Martinez to discuss her new assignment and the analytical program that would be developed based on her methods. The conversation focused on institutional changes that would ensure other analysts with unconventional backgrounds would receive appropriate recognition and support. Margaret's transformation was complete, but its significance extended beyond personal recognition to encompass systemic changes that would influence how the intelligence community identified and utilized analytical expertise. Her case had demonstrated that the most important discoveries often emerged from unexpected sources, visible only to those who combine technical competence with the courage to pursue difficult questions. Despite institutional resistance, the quiet competence that had enabled her to detect sophisticated security threats had earned recognition that transcended individual achievement, contributing to institutional improvements that would benefit future analysts and enhance national security capabilities. Her victory was measured not in personal advancement, but in systemic changes that would prevent valuable analytical contributions from being dismissed based on administrative protocols rather than professional merit. 6 months after the successful counterintelligence operation, Margaret stood before a conference room filled with intelligence analysts from facilities across the eastern seaboard, her presentation materials organized with the same methodical precision that had characterized her investigation of the communication irregularities. The Advanced Analytical Methods Training Center occupied an entire floor of the renovated intelligence facility, its state-of-the-art equipment and dedicated staff, representing institutional commitment to the analytical program that had emerged. From her case, the audience included experienced professionals whose careers had been built on sophisticated intelligence analysis, but who had gathered to learn techniques that automated systems consistently failed to replicate. Margaret's methodology had proven effective in multiple subsequent investigations, validating the human analytical approach that complemented rather than competed with electronic monitoring capabilities. Pattern recognition across disparate data sources requires systematic methodology that goes beyond individual intuition. Margaret began displaying correlation matrices that showed relationships between variables that seemed unconnected when examined independently. The key is developing analytical frameworks that can identify meaningful connections while filtering out coincidental associations. Her teaching style reflected military precision combined with academic thoroughness, presenting complex concepts with clarity that made sophisticated analytical techniques accessible to personnel with varying backgrounds and experience levels. The transformation from administrative clerk to recognized instructor represented institutional acknowledgement that analytical expertise could emerge from unexpected sources. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a recent graduate from the Defense Intelligence College, raised her hand with a question that reflected the challenges facing new analysts. "Ma'am, how do you distinguish between genuine patterns and apparent correlations that result from selective data interpretation?" Margaret's response drew from recent case studies where her analytical methods had been applied to different security challenges. Validation requires independent confirmation through multiple analytical approaches, she explained, displaying examples of successful pattern identification alongside cases where initial correlations had proven coincidental. The methodology includes built-in verification steps that test analytical conclusions against alternative explanations. The training program had expanded beyond Margaret's original techniques to include contributions from analysts throughout the intelligence community who had adapted her methods to their specific operational requirements. The collaborative approach had produced comprehensive analytical frameworks that addressed diverse security challenges while maintaining consistent methodological standards. Commander Jackson Roberts from Naval Intelligence described his application of Margaret's correlation analysis to maritime security threats. "We identified a smuggling network that had been operating undetected for 2 years," he reported, displaying charts that showed how pattern recognition had revealed connections between shipping schedules, personnel movements, and financial transactions. The automated systems had flagged individual anomalies, but they missed the coordinated nature of the operation. Margaret listened with professional satisfaction as Roberts described analytical success that validated her approach while demonstrating its adaptability to different operational contexts. Her methods had proven effective across multiple disciplines, confirming that human pattern recognition remained essential despite advances in automated analysis capabilities. The afternoon session focused on real-world applications where Margaret's techniques had prevented security breaches or identified threats that conventional analysis had missed. Agent Torres, now assigned as Deputy Director of the Analytical Program, presented case studies from counterintelligence operations at 7 different facilities where civilian analysts had successfully identified suspicious activities. The program has generated 34 security investigations over the past 6 months, Torres reported, displaying statistics that demonstrated the broader impact of Margaret's analytical approach. 12 of these investigations resulted in identification of actual security threats, including 2 cases of unauthorized information sharing and 3 instances of foreign intelligence infiltration attempts. The success rate exceeded expectations. For counterintelligence operations, validating institutional investment in analytical programs that emphasized human expertise over purely technological solutions. Margaret's case had demonstrated that sophisticated threats often exploited exactly the kinds of patterns that automated systems were designed to ignore. Dr. Hawkins provided academic perspective on the theoretical foundations that supported Margaret's practical methodology. Traditional intelligence analysis has focused on processing large data volumes through automated filtering systems. She explained, displaying research that compared human versus electronic analytical capabilities. Ms. Chen's approach demonstrates that human pattern recognition can identify complex relationships that require contextual understanding beyond current technological capabilities. The academic endorsement provided theoretical validation for analytical techniques that had been developed through practical experience rather than formal research. Margaret's methods bridge the gap between operational necessity and academic rigor, creating frameworks that satisfy both practical and theoretical requirements. Major General Patricia Hayes, Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, addressed the assembled analysts about institutional changes that had resulted from Margaret's case. "We have modified our personnel evaluation procedures to better identify analytical capabilities that may not be reflected in current job classifications," she announced, outlining policy changes that would prevent valuable expertise from being overlooked due to administrative protocols. The institutional reforms represented systematic recognition that analytical talent could emerge from diverse backgrounds and deserved evaluation based on demonstrated competence rather than educational credentials or current position classifications. Margaret's case had established precedent for recognizing expertise, regardless of its source or the conventional expectations that might initially constrain its expression. The analytical assessment program has been expanded to include civilian contractors, military personnel transitioning to new specialties, and academic researchers whose work has intelligence applications, Major General Hayes continued, describing comprehensive changes that would ensure analytical capabilities were identified and utilized effectively throughout the intelligence community. Margaret felt deep satisfaction as she listened to policy changes that would prevent other analysts from facing the institutional resistance she had encountered. The program represented systemic learning that transformed individual success into institutional improvement, ensuring that her experience would benefit future analysts, regardless of their backgrounds or current positions. During the evening session, Margaret presented advanced techniques for maintaining analytical objectivity while pursuing pattern recognition across multiple data sources. The greatest risk in correlation analysis is confirmation bias, where analysts find patterns that support preconceived conclusions rather than objective assessment of available evidence. She explained, displaying methodological safeguards that ensured analytical integrity. Her presentation included case studies where initial pattern recognition had led to incorrect conclusions, demonstrating the importance of systematic verification procedures that tested analytical findings against alternative explanations. The honest assessment of analytical limitations strengthened confidence in her methodology by acknowledging potential weaknesses while providing tools to address them. Captain David Park from Army Intelligence described his application of Margaret's techniques to personnel security investigations. "We identified a security clearance fraud scheme that involved forged documents and coordinated false testimony," he reported, displaying analytical charts that showed how pattern recognition had revealed connections between seemingly unrelated personnel files. The scheme had been operating for 3 years without detection by standard background investigation procedures. The case demonstrated how Margaret's analytical approach could be adapted to diverse security challenges, validating its broader applicability beyond the counterintelligence operations where it had originally proven effective. Her methods had become foundation elements for analytical programs throughout the intelligence community. As the training session concluded, Margaret reflected on the transformation that had occurred not only in her professional recognition, but in institutional approaches to analytical work. The program that bore her name had evolved beyond individual technique to encompass comprehensive methodological frameworks that enhanced intelligence capabilities across multiple agencies and operational contexts. Agent Torres approached Margaret after the formal session ended, carrying evaluation forms that reflected unanimous positive feedback from the training participants. "Your teaching methods are as effective as your analytical techniques," Torres observed, reviewing comments that praised both the practical value and theoretical soundness of Margaret's presentation. The participants are requesting advanced courses that would provide more detailed training in specific applications. The feedback confirmed that Margaret's transformation from administrative clerk to recognized expert had established her as a significant contributor to intelligence community capabilities. Her expertise was being sought by personnel throughout the defense establishment, validating analytical approaches that had initially been dismissed as inappropriate for civilian administrative staff. The evening concluded with informal discussions, where training participants shared their own experiences applying Margaret's methods to ongoing investigations. The conversations revealed that her analytical approach had generated successful outcomes across diverse operational contexts, confirming its broad applicability and institutional value. Margaret's quiet competence had evolved from individual achievement to institutional influence, creating analytical capabilities that would enhance national security operations for years to come. Her transformation represented more than personal recognition. It demonstrated that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources and deserved institutional support, regardless of conventional expectations about analytical qualifications. The ripple effects of her initial investigation continued expanding throughout the intelligence community, influencing training programs, operational procedures, and personnel policies that would ensure other analysts with unconventional backgrounds would receive appropriate recognition and support. Her legacy extended far beyond the specific security breach she had identified, encompassing systemic improvements that strengthened analytical capabilities across the entire defense establishment. 2 years after her initial discovery of the intelligence compromise, Margaret found herself addressing the annual Conference of Defense Intelligence Professionals. Her presentation scheduled as the keynote address for an audience that included senior analysts, academic researchers, and policymakers from across the national security establishment. The transformation from dismissed administrative clerk to internationally recognized expert represented institutional validation that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. The conference venue at the National Defense University reflected the significance that her analytical methodology had achieved within intelligence circles. Representatives from allied nations had requested inclusion in her training programs, recognizing that the human analytical approach she had developed could enhance their own counterintelligence capabilities against sophisticated threats that automated systems consistently failed to detect. The integration of human intuition with systematic analytical frameworks has proven essential for identifying complex security threats, Margaret explained to the assembly of several hundred intelligence professionals. Our success rate in detecting unauthorized intelligence sharing has improved by 47% since implementing comprehensive pattern recognition training programs based on correlation analysis techniques. Her presentation included case studies from intelligence facilities throughout North America and Europe, where her methods have been adapted to local operational requirements while maintaining consistent analytical standards. The international adoption of her techniques demonstrated that the principles she had discovered transcended cultural and organizational boundaries. Colonel Martinez, now promoted to Brigadier General and serving as Director of Counterintelligence Operations, provided institutional perspective on the broader impact of Margaret's analytical approach. Ms. Chen's methodology has influenced policy changes that affect how we identify, evaluate, and utilize analytical expertise throughout the defense establishment, she announced, outlining systematic reforms that had emerged from Margaret's Case. The policy changes included modified personnel evaluation procedures, expanded training programs, and formal recognition mechanisms that ensured analytical capabilities would be identified and supported regardless of their source or the crudely conventional expectations that might initially constrain their expression. Margaret's experience had established precedent for institutional flexibility that valued competence over administrative protocol. Dr. Hawkins, now serving as academic director for the Advanced Analytical Methods program, described research initiatives that had grown from Margaret's practical discoveries. We have established collaborative relationships with universities throughout the United States and several allied nations to develop theoretical frameworks that support the analytical techniques that Ms. Chen pioneered through operational necessity. The academic validation provided scholarly foundation for methods that had been developed through practical experience rather than formal research, creating comprehensive educational programs that satisfied both operational requirements and theoretical standards. Margaret's bridge between practical and academic approaches had generated institutional capabilities that neither community could have achieved independently. During the question period that followed her presentation, Margaret addressed inquiries from intelligence professionals who sought guidance about implementing her techniques within their own organizations. The questions reflected widespread recognition of her expertise and demonstrated that her analytical approach had become standard methodology for addressing sophisticated security threats. The conference concluded with announcements about expanded international cooperation in analytical training and research, initiatives that would further develop the methodological frameworks Margaret had established. Her transformation from overlooked administrative personnel to recognized leader in intelligence analysis represented institutional recognition that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources and deserved support based on demonstrated competence. Rather than conventional qualifications, Margaret's legacy had evolved from individual achievement to systemic institutional improvement, creating analytical capabilities that enhanced national security operations while establishing precedent for recognizing and utilizing expertise regardless of its source or the administrative protocols that might initially limit its expression. 5 years after the initial security breach investigation, Margaret stood in the newly constructed Margaret Chen Center for Advanced Intelligence Analysis, watching the latest cohort of civilian analysts complete their certification program. The facility represented institutional commitment to analytical education that had grown from her individual case into comprehensive training infrastructure, serving intelligence agencies across multiple government departments. The center's curriculum had evolved beyond her original pattern recognition techniques to encompass interdisciplinary approaches that integrated linguistic analysis, financial investigation, and technical assessment capabilities. Students arrived from diverse backgrounds, including former military personnel, academic researchers, and civilian professionals whose expertise had been overlooked by traditional recruitment methods. Today's graduation ceremony represents completion of the most comprehensive analytical training program in the intelligence community, announced Director James Patterson, who had been appointed to lead the center based on his successful implementation of Margaret's methods at 3 different facilities. These analysts will deploy to assignments where their specialized capabilities will enhance security operations worldwide. Margaret observed the ceremony with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that many graduates faced career trajectories similar to her own experience, but with institutional support that would prevent the resistance and skepticism she had encountered. The program had created pathways for analytical expertise that transcended conventional boundaries between military and civilian personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Susan Walsh, one of the first military officers to complete the Civilian Analytical Methods course, described her application of Margaret's techniques to oversee security operations. The correlation analysis methodology enabled us to identify recruitment patterns that foreign intelligence services were using to target American personnel. She reported, outlining successful counterintelligence operations in 3 different countries. The international applications of Margaret's analytical approach had expanded through cooperative agreements with allied intelligence services who had adapted her methods to address region-specific security challenges. British, Canadian, and Australian agencies had integrated her techniques into their training programs, creating analytical capabilities that enhanced collective security through shared methodological standards. Dr. Maria Rodriguez from the University of Maryland presented research findings that quantified the effectiveness of human analytical approaches compared to automated detection systems. Hybrid analysis that combines Ms. Chen's pattern recognition techniques with electronic monitoring capabilities has proven 63% more effective at identifying sophisticated security threats than either approach used independently. The academic research validated Margaret's practical discoveries, while providing theoretical framework that supported continued development of analytical methodologies. The combination of operational success and scholarly endorsement had established her approach as fundamental doctrine within intelligence education programs. The ceremony concluded with presentation of the annual Chen Award for Analytical Excellence, recognizing civilian analysts whose work had demonstrated exceptional pattern recognition capabilities, while operating within institutional constraints that might have discouraged less persistent individuals. The award represented institutional commitment to identifying and supporting analytical expertise, regardless of its source. Margaret's address to the graduating class emphasized the importance of professional courage in pursuing analytical conclusions. Despite institutional resistance or skepticism from colleagues who might not understand sophisticated pattern recognition work, your analytical capabilities are valuable assets that deserve institutional support, but you must be prepared to advocate for your findings through professional persistence and documented evidence. The graduates would deploy to assignments throughout the intelligence community, carrying analytical skills that had been refined through comprehensive training programs, while maintaining the intellectual independence that enabled innovative approaches to complex security challenges. Margaret's legacy continued expanding through each analyst who applied her methods to new operational contexts, creating multiplicative effects that enhanced national security capabilities far beyond what individual expertise could achieve independently. Center represented institutional recognition that analytical excellence could emerge from diverse backgrounds and deserved systematic support through comprehensive education programs that prepared analysts for leadership roles throughout the intelligence community. 20 years later, Margaret walked through the halls of the Pentagon as the newly appointed Director of National Intelligence Analysis, her journey from dismissed secretary to the highest analytical position in government complete. The walls displayed photographs of successful operations that had utilized the methodology she had pioneered, each image representing lives saved and threats neutralized through patient pattern recognition. Her morning briefing included reports from analysts worldwide who had been trained in her techniques, their discoveries preventing security breaches, terrorist attacks, and intelligence compromises that automated systems had missed. The quiet competence that had once made her invisible had become the foundation for analytical capabilities that protected millions of people who would never know her name. As she reviewed the daily intelligence summary, Margaret noticed a familiar pattern in the data, subtle anomalies that suggested emerging threats requiring human analytical expertise. Some things never changed. The most dangerous enemy still hid in plain sight, visible only to those who understood that the most important discoveries often whispered rather than shouted. She opened her notebook, its pages now digital but its purpose unchanged, and began documenting observations that others might dismiss as insignificant noise. After all these years, the work continued. Somewhere in the vast stream of information flowing through government systems, Patterns waited to be discovered by analysts who understood that true vigilance never sought recognition but always deserved respect. The secretary who had been called paranoid for reading too carefully had become the leader who taught others to see what conventional wisdom chose to ignore. Margaret Chen's story proves that your background doesn't determine your potential, your persistence does. Sometimes the most important voices belong to those everyone underestimates. What did you think of Margaret's incredible journey? Have you ever felt overlooked because of your position or background? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through quiet determination and professional excellence.